All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. As Maxine wonderfully introduced, this is going to be the first of two sessions exploring the role of fear and divine kingship and human kingship in thinking about, Elul and Tishrei and the high holidays, where it comes up in both the text of the tefillot and the prayers that we say throughout the high holidays, and then also in general, thinking about the period of the time. We often hear discussions of Rosh Hashanah as sort of crowning God King and things like that. And I think there are all kinds of really wonderful things that have been said about that, interpretations given throughout the Jewish tradition of both God's kingship and also the question of what does it mean to fear God, to have fear of God, or reverence for God, what Yirah Hashem, Yirat Shamayim means. But I think that there's a sort of simple sense to it that's lost, that it can be itself be very meaningful because of how foreign the idea of fear feels to contemporary, modern individuals. Feel like we don't want to feel like we're supposed to be afraid, or like fear has any real role in our lives. We feel like it's a bad thing. So we want to look at this week and the next week is some sort of foundational texts from the Western political tradition that we'll talk about fear, and we'll explore them a little this week. There'll be a little more of those texts because we've just set up the basis. Next week will be a class you can come to independently, but we'll build on this week, so it won't need quite as much background. And they will, I think, give some ideas of what fear can do politically, the way it responds to maybe the part of human nature. And we'll see what that can mean for us religiously. This week we'll look in a sense at what that means if we try and draw a parallel between sort of divine and human kingship. And then next week we'll look a little more at the way those two things might interact. Without further ado, I want to share my screen. I'm going to have a PowerPoint up. I think Maxine also has the sources, which will be everything that's on the PowerPoint for anyone who wants to have them going forward, or just to look at them, on a single sort of page. But I will also be sharing my screen with the PowerPoint. Okay, so this week the general trajectory of discussing fear of God, Nexus to divine and human kingship, will bring us to a focus of fear and forgiveness, right? And the way those two might be intertwined in terms of thinking about human nature. And obviously we'll connect it to the high holiday season and the idea of asking for forgiveness, and Yom Kippur praying for forgiveness, and we'll get to that towards the end. The goals of this class are to reflect on and think more deeply about our concepts like fear and divine kingship. They're the kind of things that we either grow up with or choose at a later date, but then become accustomed to, and they become sort of second nature to us, to the point where you often take them for granted. So this is a good example of this. Someone, after I began advertising this class, a colleague reached out and asked if there was a reason I had chosen to use the phrase kingship, particularly when applied to divine kingship, as opposed to like a gender neutral term like sovereign or monarch or something like that. And the real answer is I just didn't think about it, right? I think there's good reasons to maybe keep using the ostensibly masculine kingship. But I think that like the real answer is that I hadn't really paused to even think about it. It was a term I'm used to hearing and thinking with. And so part of what I want to do this week and next week, and I hope you'll do along with me, is to reflect on these terms and what they mean and try and examine them a little more thoroughly. In the process, we'll also look at texts from the Siddur and texts from the Tanakh, from the Hebrew Bible, and look at them a little more deeply. Finally, and looking at the way that all of those affect the way we think about human nature and the holidays of this season. So I'm going to start with this passage from the Amidah, the silent prayers of the Yom Kippur, the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur tefillot. And I'll just read, this is my own English translation of this sort of standard Hebrew text. O Lord, instill fear of you in all your works, and terror of you in all that you created, and all the works will fear you, and all the creatures will bow before you, and they will all form one collective to wholeheartedly perform your will. And I'll note that a lot of interpretations of fear of God in sort of the Jewish tradition will say, well, the term yirah, the most common term involved, really doesn't mean yirah. It doesn't mean like fear. It means reverence or something like that. But here, in addition to the term yirah, you'll also find emata. Ematcha means much more clearly fear, and it's just hard to avoid the fact that something like the way we think of fear of bad consequences, fear of something happening to us, there's some sense of that in terms of Yirat Shamayim. The Jewish tradition includes many interpretations of what it means to have fear of God, and so I'm going to say from the outset that this is not going to be exhaustive of the term, but I hope to sort of recover a basic understanding of fear in a simple sense as something valuable, as something worth at least thinking about and considering, even if ultimately you prefer to think of Yirat Shamayim in some other sense. So I want to look at two philosophers. Maybe like most people have heard of at least one of them, Niccolo Machiavelli. The other second is Thomas Hobbes. And they are two, as I said, basic political thinkers. They are part of a school called political realism, in the sense of the idea that they try and argue for a specific vision of human nature that's realistic, as opposed to other thinkers who would be, more optimistic about human nature, or some people who would be called utopian. These thinkers tend to be considered realists. And the obvious response to that is that realists are just what pessimists call themselves, that maybe realists are really pessimists and just trying to pretend they're not. But what I think they push in a good direction in terms of trying to, ask what humans are like, right? And not like what we could be like, how we want to see ourselves or think about ourselves, but is there a gap there, right? Trying to ask that question as well. Is there a gap between the way we think of ourselves and the way we actually are? And if so, which one do we want to be basing our thinking about human nature on the way we are, on the way we could be, and trying to think about that as well. So Niccolo Machiavelli lives in the end of the 1400s, beginning of the 1500s. Is sort of famous.
Interrupt for a second, Levi Morrow. Do you mean to be screen sharing?
I am. Am I not screen sharing?
I don't see it, and I don't think Kathy Friedman does either.
Interesting. I'm told I'm being told that I'm screen sharing, but I will stop and start again. Lovely. Okay, so this is a painting of Niccolo Machiavelli. He is somewhat more well known. He's known often because his name made it relatively quickly into a much more popular usage outside of just people interested in political philosophy. Someone can be called Machiavellian, and everyone knows immediately that means the person is, if not evil, then at the very least amoral and willing to use force to get what they want. There's some misunderstandings about that, because it's going to come from a book we're going to look at in a second, called The Prince, that he wrote. And The Prince is sort of famously encourages that sort of way of thinking. But if you read a sort of broader expanse of his texts, he's actually a Republican. He's not interested in having a prince. He wants to have a republic. And there have been some interesting readings in recent years of him as maybe certainly supporting democracy, maybe even some form of anarchism. But we're going to look at what he's famous for, the text that says maybe it's a good thing to be feared, right? So this is from his book, The Prince, which he wrote in 1513, but is really actually only published in 1532 after he dies. But the section called Of Cruelty and Clemency, Whether It Is Better to Be Loved or Feared, right? So straight to the point, and say, if this book is written as a sort of a guidebook for someone who's going to be a prince, which in this case means just that much like we think of a king, sort of the singular ruler of a people, and he's going to talk about whether it's better to be feared or loved. Right? So one ought to be both feared and loved, he says, straight to the point. But as it is difficult for the two to go together, it is much safer to be feared than loved. If one of the two has to be wanting, it wants to be. For it may be said that of men in general, that they are ungrateful, voluble, dissemblers, anxious to avoid danger, and covetous of gain. As long as you benefit them, they are entirely yours. They offer you their blood, their goods, their life, and their children, as I've said before, when necessity is remote. But when it approaches, they revolt, right? So people aren't great. They will give you whatever you want as long as you're taking good to them, as long as they're not actually, experiencing a sense of need. But as soon as things are tough, as soon as times are no longer, times of abundance, then they will rebel against you. And the prince who has relied solely on their words without making other preparations is ruined. For the friendship which is gained by purchase and not through grandeur and nobility of spirit is bought but not secured. And the pinch is not to be expended in your service. And men have less scruple in offending one who makes himself loved than one who makes himself feared. For love is held by a chain of obligation, which, men being selfish, is broken whenever it serves their purpose. Fear is maintained by a dread of punishment, which never fails. Right? So there's something more secure. He says, use that word, more secure in fear. That love might create a good relationship, but there's no way of sort of guaranteeing the relationship. And fear is ultimately somewhat more certain, that the relationship is more stable because fear appeals to some aspect of human beings more consistently than love does. And so finally, still a prince should not make himself feared in such a way that if he does not gain love, he at any rate avoids hatred. For fear and the absence of hatred may go well together and will be always attained by one who abstains from interfering with the property of his citizens and subjects. I conclude, therefore, with regard to being feared and loved, that men love at their own free will, but fear at the will of the prince, and that a wise prince must rely on what is in his power, and not what is in his power of others. So he must only contrive to avoid incurring hatred, as has been explained. Right? So he is going to conclude that while he started off by saying, it's good to be loved and feared, ultimately just worry about not like being feared and not actually actively making your subjects hate you. Right? So you can't control necessarily whether they love you. You can do your best to make sure they don't hate you. That is Machiavelli. And if I was going to sum up, and I'll stop share for a second. I'm going to sum up. Machiavelli is saying a couple of things. First, that there's, he says people are bad. That's his starting assumption. And we're going to see in a minute that Thomas Hobbes develops this a little more thoroughly and thinks it through. Because the people aren't great. People, you can have a really good relationship with someone, but the moment things are tough for them, they're going to make decisions sort of on their own, for their own sake and based on their own needs. And therefore, he says, you should, as a ruler, seek out them fearing. And I think that's an interesting question that we're going to have to wonder about when it comes to religious text, which is like, if there's a mitzvah to fear God, why does God want to be feared? In terms of what is God's angle on that per se? Why is that valuable? Right. And so again, we're not going to look at every text that exists on the fear of God, but I think that is going to represent our starting point. Is also that question as well. I want to get through the Hobbes text, and then we'll stop a second to do questions before we move into the Jewish texts. I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, so this is Thomas Hobbes with the excellent facial hair. He lived after it was born 50 years or so after Machiavelli, 60 years after Machiavelli died, lived to the ripe old age of 91. Nice life in his time. Wrote, like Machiavelli, a variety of texts, but this is the one for which he is famous. This is the famous sort of front page of his book Leviathan, and you can see here you have this sort of supreme ruler ruling over all of the land, towering over it with crown, sword, as well as the scepter, the symbol of the church at the time. There's a lot going on there. Classes and classes have been given on that alone. But we're going to jump into looking at two chapters in this book. Chapter 13, where he's going to lay out what is become known as the state of nature, the question of what are people like outside of a state, outside of political society, and then texts on what are people like, how do we get from the state of nature to a state of society, and what Hobbes has in mind for that. So he This is from chapter 13. Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power. I should note that Machiavelli wrote his book in Italian. I don't remember where that got that translation from, which version. This Hobbes actually wrote in English. That's one of the nice things about Hobbes. Hereby it's manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war. And such a war as of every man against every man, right? So if there's no power structure to keep people, from fighting each other, then you're at war. For war consists not in battle only, or the act of fighting, but in an attractive time wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known. This is war, he's going to say, is not just when the people are actively fighting one person against another, but any time where that's how people are going to solve their problems, and that actual fighting could break out at any time. Whatsoever, therefore, is consequent to a time of war, where every man is enemy to every man, the same is consequent to the time wherein men live without other security than what their own strength and their own invention shall furnish them withal. And right, that's ultimately what happens when the only way people have to settle issues is their own strength. Right? If it comes down to people have no greater rubric or framework to which to appeal, where they can say, look, I think this person owes me something. I want you, the state, to help me get it back. There's a court of law or something. Without something like that, then it ultimately comes down to the question of who's stronger, and that's going to lead to just fighting all the time. In such condition, there is no place for industry. And here's an interesting twist. There's no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and the danger of violent death. And here's a famous line: the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. As he says, that assuming he's correct, that the natural state of people outside of a political society is a state of war, a state where people are constantly resorting to strength and physical force to try and resolve their interpersonal difficulties, then you're also not going to get the kind of cooperation and collaboration you need to build a robust civilization. The thing to get, is navigation and, import and export across the ocean, mass transit, even the arts and things that require luxury and people living together safely and, if not happily necessarily, certainly quietly and calmly and without, fighting. All of those, the degree of peace that's necessary for, a rich human life. He thinks because he says people, are prone to fighting when there's no larger authority to sort out their disputes, then you won't get any of these things. Right. So through this thought experiment, it may be perceived what manner of life there would be where there were no common power to fear by the manner of life which men that have formerly lived under government used to degenerate into in a civil war. Right. This is what it's like if there were no government, and then if the government comes apart, it would into a civil war. This sort of life would emerge again. And I think it's important to note here again, he's in some sense basically defined government. What it means to have a government is to have a common power to fear. Some ultimately is if the state of nature, the natural state of human beings, he says, is that people are just fighting each other one after another all the time. Whoever's stronger wins. Then what ultimately brings people together and stops the small fights between the small, strengths, each individual person who's stronger than everyone else, is to have one power that is stronger than all the others. So one singular person to fear that keeps you from having to worry about the sort of anarchy and the violent anarchy of fighting everyone around you. And so that's his basic understanding of human nature, that he's going to build on that to try and think about how do we get from there to a society. Right. So this is chapter 17. And bear with me, because this part is a little more complicated. I'll explain it as we go. This is the final cause, end, or design of men who naturally love liberty and dominion over others in the introduction of that restraint particular upon themselves. We see them live in commonwealths Right? He says the ultimate reason which people who don't really want to be ruled, right? People love liberty and dominion over others. People don't want to have someone else in charge of them, but they do it for a reason. The reason that people introduce the restraint of government upon themselves is the foresight of their own preservation and a more contented life thereby. Right? People recognize that giving up a degree of freedom is a good way to get a safer life. That is to say, of getting themselves out of that miserable condition of war, which is necessarily consequent to the natural passions of men, when there is no visible power to keep them in awe, and tie them by fear of punishment to the performance of their covenants and observation of laws of nature set down in the previous chapters, right? So the chapters in between the one we just read and what we're looking at now, right? So that without government, and this is sort of a key point as well, that returns back to Machiavelli. He says there's no way to keep people to performance of their covenants, right? The idea that people might, and Machiavelli is concerned that without fear, you'll have a good relationship with your citizens. So whoever's in charge, they will be able to rely on the people they rule to listen to them and to work with them and have a good society when things are good. But when things are tough, then they'll renege on their covenants. They will not stick to their agreements. So both Machiavelli and Hobbes are concerned that on a very specific point of like long-term projects, or trying to get people to work together long-term requires them not to make agreements with one another, and also like keep making those agreements and sticking to those agreements over time. And both of them think that really requires some sort of larger fear. The only way to erect such a common power as may be able to defend them from the invasion of foreigners and the injuries of one another, and thereby to secure them in such sort as that by their own industry and by the fruits of the earth they may nourish themselves and live contentedly, is to confer all their power and strength upon one man, or upon one assembly of men, that may reduce all their wills by plurality of voices unto one will, which is as much as to say, to appoint one man or assembly of men to bear their person, right? So Hobbes has really this worked out theory. It's not Machiavelli's, the prince, the hereditary dictator who is in charge by virtue of being born into the role should instill fear upon the subjects. Hobbes is really in many ways the beginning of something like democracy. He thinks that everyone should come together and agree to appoint a one man or assembly of men. He says here, he ultimately says it should be one person. It should be like a dictator. But he thinks that comes only from the consent of the governed, right? And he has, this would go well beyond our class here, but he has specific conditions under which it makes sense to rebel, and the person is no longer, has the authority to really tell you what to do, and you should rebel against that dictator. But he says here, the way that we get out of the state of nature, out of the state of war, is when everyone agrees we'd rather have one person with power over us. We agree to be governed, then and therefore we can work together and create a life that works to get well to whatever minimal degree that we're happy and able to live contentedly. We'd much rather that than be fighting all the time. This done, the multitude so united in one person is called a commonwealth, in Latin civitas, right? The creation of a state. This is the generation of the great Leviathan, it's the title of the book, right? Rather, to speak more reverently, of that mortal God to which we owe, under the immortal God, our peace and defense. And that duality of the mortal God and the immortal God is one we'll return to next week. But by this authority given him by every particular man in the commonwealth, he hath the use of so much power and strength conferred on him, that by terror thereof he is enabled to conform the will of them all to peace at home and mutual aid against their enemies abroad. Right. So the final idea here, again, was to sort of round out our political background for this class before we jump into some Jewish texts, is that this is the state, the powerful entity that we can all agree to come together to create, corresponds to and responds to this understanding of human nature as inherently self-interested, as potentially open to working together with other people, but also weak and inclined to renege on agreements and back out of what Hobbes called covenants at the moment things get tough. Right? The idea that in order for us to commit to things long term and really try and live a better life, it actually we need someone who's going to, instead of make us, or we feel is going to make us. One thing I want to note before we move on is this is still active in states today, right? I think this doesn't do a good job of capturing every aspect of what it means to be a citizen, but most people know, in living in an established state today, that there is a law that in theory, if you break it, there's punishment for that, and you can get caught and punished. And there's different degrees of how likely you are to get caught, how likely you are to be punished for something. There's sort of a whole thick and complicated legal system in most countries, and that tends to buffer us a little bit from sort of the way we think of this sort of immediacy Hobbes depicts and Machiavelli depict of, like, if you do something wrong, the government is going to punish you and you should be scared of the government. But the basic sense is still there of the government is this body that can make you live up to your commitments, and you have to keep that in mind, right? So that this fear and terror that Hobbes talked about doesn't have to be on the sort of immediate level of I'm shaking in my boots. It can be a sort of more austere and almost cognitive fear, that you're aware of this and aware that there might be some reason you should be scared in a certain situation which you could choose to enter. If you choose to break the law, if you choose to attack someone and try and sort of provoke the state of war that Hobbes is talking about. And just because it fits with this so lovely, before we get into talking about the way this fits into religion and thinking about fear of God, there's a text from Mishnah Avot. We find the exact same way of thinking about government. Rabbi Hanina Sgan Kohanim used to say, right? The Hanina, the vice high priest, said, "Pray for the welfare of the government, for were it not for the fear it inspires, every man would swallow his neighbor alive." Ishet rehu chaim below. Right? Says that it is a good thing to pray for government, because specifically what government is for is because it's for people afraid of the government, without which they would consume each other. They would eat each other alive. I'm going to stop sharing for a second, see if anyone has any questions.
There is, I guess, some thoughts from Ozzy Orbach on Facebook.
Yes.
So he says, the Book of Prophets demonstrates that fear may work on a temporary basis in correcting behavior, like cognitive behavioral therapy, but does not solve the underlying problem as demonstrated by the people going back to their old ways. Even God knows that maintaining a sense of fear forever is not psychologically healthy, because it diminishes one's sense of freedom of choice, which is necessary for human health. Continuous fear leads to anger, which is really the flip side of fear. Thus, all totalitarian regimes ultimately fail. The COVID epidemic shows that telling people what to do doesn't work.
There's a lot of different stuff in there. I will say briefly, and this will also respond to Quincy in the chat as well, that the relationship between fear and freedom and liberty, and the way fear is not a good basis for politics in its entirety, right? You can't run a society just based on fear for a variety of reasons. I think we'll touch on a little more next week. Next week, we're going to look at some work from Spinoza, Benedict Spinoza, who builds off of Hobbes's picture and then takes it in a different direction. This is a book of prophets. I think paints a very complex picture. Also, to put it in terms of what comes immediately thereafter. Book of Judges. Judges might be, in some ways, a story about how Jewish people aren't supposed to have kings, but also maybe need a king, and how those two sit together is a whole different series of classes. So with that, then I think I'll move on. If someone else needs clarity on anything I've said so far, and look at how this might shape the way we think about, some primal texts from the Torah, and then at the Chagim. So yeah, I will share my screen again. Second. Okay. And so part of what I want to get at here is that this idea of fearing God, and the way we're going to see it mirrored relatively similarly in the same in some of the texts, is that sort of the idea of fearing government that we've seen in the text so far today, and the way it'll be matched relatively closely in some basic texts from the Torah. Is that part of what is being captured is the idea of God as king, where there's some sort of basic parallel there. And there might be, that might also have to do with the way, and we're going to get to this towards the end of the class, that like Tanakh actually understands human nature and perhaps in similar ways. So the first text I'm looking at this is from the very end of Shemot Perek Chaf, the 20th chapter of the book of Exodus, from after the 10 commandments, the giving of the Seder Divrot, when the people have experienced this revelation in whatever sense. There's this right before the end of the parsha, before we're going to move into the code of laws that constitutes Mishpatim. There's this short little interlude. It says, "V'kol ha'am ro'im et kolot v'talapidim." All the people witnessed the thunder and the lightning, v'kol ha'shofar, and the blare of the shofar horn, v'har ha'shein, and the mountain was smoking. V'yar ha'am v'yanu'u v'yamdu merachok. People saw it; they fell back and stood at a distance. Right, so the people have experienced this great revelation, and they fall back, and move away from the mountain. They say to Moshe, Daber ata imanu, you speak with us. V'nishma, and we will listen over here. Al yadaber imanu Elohim hen namut, and God not speak to us lest we die. Moshe el ha'am, and Moshe said to the people, Al tirau, don't be afraid. Ki leba'avur na'asot etchem ba Elohim. For God has come only in order to test you. Uba'avur tihiyeh yirato al pnechem lebilti techatau. In order that the fear of him may be ever with you, so that you do not go astray. Right, so I can't explore this in its entirety. We're not going to get into what it might mean that God, came to test you. But the second purpose here is what matters, is critical for our context, right? In order that the fear of him may be ever with you, so that you do not go astray. And the root for go astray, chata, is related, of course, to the term for sin. It's just saying the people are afraid. People are visibly afraid, to the point where they, as a whole collective group, flinch. They shrink back from the mountain. They come to Moshe and say, how about you speak to us, because otherwise we're going to die. So Moshe says, first is don't be afraid. And as the commentaries on this pasuk explain, they don't be afraid that you're going to die, because you have to explain why Moshe says don't be afraid. God has done this only in order that you should be afraid. Right? So don't be afraid that you're going to die. God doesn't want you to die. God is trying to be scary. Right? And so if we think about the whole scene at Har Sinai, the scene of the revelation of the 10 Commandments, Moshe is saying that it's visibly and sensorily impressive. It's, audible, and you smelling the smoke and feeling like there's fire, and it would have been terrifying. And the reason for that is not an accident. It's not that God sort of necessarily can only be, do a revelation in this manner. There's actually a lot of thought and intention that go into the sound and light show at Har Sinai. That a lot of depictions of Har Sinai focus on the content of it, and on some level, Moshe is saying one of the most important aspects of this the 10 Commandments scene is not the content of the 10 Commandments. Like, that's important as well, but the whole setting, the theatrics of Har Sinai is just as important, or it's perhaps a underlying condition that's fundamentally important for the whole project, right? The fear of God should be on your faces. It should be visible upon your faces that you have this fear, or in the English here, that it may ever be with you, so that you do not go astray. There's a sense, much like we saw in the previous text, that the fear of God is something that works as a preventative, that without it, you might sin, you might go astray, you might fall away from the covenant that's just now being established, and that is about to get a whole list of rules and commandments added to it in the next chapters. The yira, the fear, is an underlying condition that and going to make it possible for people to participate in that more broadly and for a extended duration, right? And so on some level, what happens at Har Sinai, and this is also particularly, I didn't bring this text, but if you go back to the beginning of the Har Sinai scene at the previous chapter, Shemot Yutet, Exodus 19, is where you get the famous passage of, the Jews will be a kingdom of priests. But God says, I will be to you as a God, and you will be to me as a goy kadosh, a melech kohanim, an am we will be sort of a special people for God. This is a moment when God appears as sort of the sovereign, the king of the Jewish people, the God of the Jewish people, and says we're going to create this covenant, this brit. This is the creation of the brit between the Jewish people, the covenant of Jewish people and God. And an underlying part of that is a question of, what's going to keep the Jews from backing out at any moment of this covenant. And it's also worth noting this, the scene of Har Sinai caps a series of, minor rebellions in the desert. It's not the last one. There'll be more in the book of Bamidbar, book of Numbers. But between the leaving Egypt in Bereshit Yud Bet Yud Gimel and the 12th and 13th chapters of Shemot, and when they get to the mountain in chapters 18, 19 of Shemot, there are multiple, I think 5, but there are multiple times the Jews already rebel against Moshe and already say like, oh, things were better in Egypt, right? So the Jewish people are already having trouble committing long term to the going to be with God out in the desert model of they're experiencing now, or whatever that's going to lead. And Moshe is saying this is meant to be scary because you're going to remember this, and it's going to help you get through the moments when you might otherwise not be as strong-willed and not be able to follow the rules that you might otherwise wish you were following. You're not going to be able to be helping build the society that you wanted to be building without this fear. This fear will help you keep doing that even when your lesser nature might get the better of you. And we're looking now at sort of 2 instances of the mitzvah for fearing God, right? It's a mitzvah to fear God that comes from explicit psukim, and noting their context will help us, when they flesh this out in light of some of the ways we've been thinking about politics so far, and thinking about ultimately the Jewish people and the as a polity, as in some sense of a society that is being constructed with God as the sovereign of that society, right? That's really, in some sense, what's happening with this mitzvot. And so this is from the 6th chapter of Devarim. Take heed that you do not forget the Lord who freed you from the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. So fear only the Lord your God and worship him alone and swear only by his name. Right. So here the fearing of God comes specifically in context of the question of whose name do you use when you swear. And do not go after other gods from the other nations that are around, or the gods of the nations that are around you. Ki el kana Hashem Elohecha b'kirecha pen yechara af Hashem Elohecha bach v'hishmidcha me'al pnei ha'adama. For the Lord your God in your midst is an impassioned God, or a jealous God in a more traditional translation. Lest the anger of the Lord your God blaze forth against you, and he wipe you off the face of the earth. Right. So the last verse here, worth noting, is one of those verses that we as modern individuals often have the most trouble with. Because God is a jealous God is a hard pill to swallow, a bitter pill to swallow. But I think it's worth thinking before we even get to that about the previous verses, right? Take heed that you do not forget the Lord who freed you from the land of Egypt, the house of bondage, and not forgetting God is a theme throughout Sefer Devarim. But it hits on exactly the point we've been talking about of the question of long term, right? As people, are we going to be able to, as Jews, and as human beings, are we going to be able to maintain this society, this like people who live according to the Torah long term? Is that something we're up for and capable of? And what are the conditions for us to do that? And as well, immediately after the commandment to fear, here comes the question of other gods and the gods of the peoples around you, right? That the question is, can we maintain long term this one commitment to our God that we've already committed to, and what's the likelihood we're going to seek out other sovereigns, other sources of power, other people to listen to. And this mitzvah is asserting that if we can bring ourselves to think about God in terms of fear, in terms of there are consequences for our actions, then that will enable us to maintain this long term. And the other time in Devarim this comes up is in the 10th chapter. And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God demand of you? Only this, to fear the Lord, to walk only in his paths, to love him, and to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and soul. לשמור את מצוות Hashem ואת חוקותיו אשר אנוכי מצווך היום לטוב לך. To love him and to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, to keeping the Lord's commandments and laws, which I enjoin upon you today for your good. Hen laHashem Elohecha hashamayim u'shmei hashamayim ha'aretz akol asher ba. Mark the heavens to their uttermost reaches, belong to the Lord your God, the earth and all that is on it. All right, so here, I think this is also important because as we touched on before, once people asked questions about it, before we started looking at the Torah texts, fear is not the only aspect of the, this polity, this society where we're seeing the Torah envisioned with Hashem, sort of the sovereign Hashem as the head of the society. It's not just about fear, right? Fear is one of multiple things that we're being told that God asks you only to do all this, list of things: fear God, walk in God's paths, love him, serve God with all your heart and soul, commandments in the Torah, right? There's a variety of things here, but one of the key aspects of it is fear. So fear is, as I'm hitting on throughout, it's an underlying condition. It's sort of a bedrock. Fear is what enables people in this vision of human nature to create the rest of the life we want to live, right? To the degree that walking in God's paths and loving God and serving God and following the mitzvot, keeping the commandments are part of a much larger project, things that we want to do with other people, things that we want to do day after day, year after year. Then the question becomes, how do we see ourselves? How do we think about ourselves in ways that will keep us doing that, even on the days when it doesn't feel comfortable, right? And I return to Machiavelli, who said that if you build a relationship based on the fact that he's a love, but I might say in some sense he just means by love, like the fact that it feels good, the fact that I enjoy doing something is my basis for doing it, and I am drawn to doing a basis for doing it. When life gets tough, when things get busy, when so mentioned earlier, COVID, when there's a pandemic and everything suddenly changes, what are the commitments I keep to? What are the commitments I don't keep to? A basic underlying aspect of that is the question of what do I think there are consequences for my actions, right? When I think there are consequences, which are the most basic understanding of what fear means in this context, though that's going to be an important part of what I actually keep to and what I don't keep to. I want to look quickly at, let's see how much time we have left. Okay, we got about 10 minutes left. I'm going to leave some time for questions at the end. So I'm not going to do the next section, which is a couple of medieval interpretations that reinforce this way of thinking about the mitzvot. From the Sefer Chinuch, which is a book that goes through all of the mitzvot from the Rambam's collection, listing of the 613 mitzvot. And this lays out, again, basically the same way of thinking about fear of punishment as what the meaning of fear of God. And this is from Rambam Maimonides Mor Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed. And this is from near the end of it, where he goes through, again, this sort of idea that talks about think yourself as always being in the presence of the king, and that it should create a sense of humility, awe, and fear that will keep you doing the right thing at all times, because you always see yourself sort of in the presence of the king. And this will come back to next week in a version of it cited by later halachic commentators. I wanted to look quickly at what this means for us in terms of thinking about forgiveness and the human nature in terms of the Jewish calendar, more Jewish thought and Jewish text more broadly, and specifically in terms of this moment in the Jewish calendar. This Sefer Bereshit, the book of Genesis, includes a variety of statements about human nature, but I'll hit on two from both before and after the flood. The one that God brings upon the earth when he sees that people are not capable of living a good life, not creating a good society together, things are going terribly. There's a very interesting statement before and afterwards that touches on exactly this sort of issue, right? The Lord, the English, the Lord saw how great was man's wickedness on earth, and how every plan devised by his mind was nothing but evil all the time, right? And the Lord regretted that he had made man on earth, and his heart was saddened. We have zero time to get into what it means for God to regret something or to be sad. But this is the introduction to the flood, essentially, right? God sees that people are not working out because people are bad. And therefore God brings the flood, right? I'm going to jump forward 2 chapters. After the flood, Noach comes out of the flood, and one of the things he eventually does is brings korbanot, brings sacrifices. The Lord smelled the pleasing odor of Noach's sacrifices, and the Lord said to himself, "Never again will I doom the earth because of man, since the divine devisings of man's mind are evil from his youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living being as I have done." Right? So God says, I'm no longer going to be cursing the earth because man is terrible. Right? And I think when I first sort of realized what that said, it very much surprised me, probably for other people as well, right? You'd expect God says, "Oh, I'm not going to, I'm not going to bring a flood on the earth ever again. I'm going to stop sort of cursing the earth." And notably, Kalel Odet Hadamat, curse the earth, recalls not just the flood, but also the punishment to Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, at the end of the 3rd chapter of Bereshit of the Torah, and then also to Cain after, in some sense, the earth is filled with the blood of Cain's first murder, murdering Hevel. The earth is cursed again. Then, this is all, like God says, all of the bad things people have done so far, I'm going to stop punishing them for it. I'm going to stop making consequences for that. Not because people have redeemed themselves, people have done great things and sort of come out of it, but because people are bad. Like there's some sort of fundamental underlying evil in human beings, and they're, because of that, not going to have strict consequences the same way, right? And so this is cuts to some degree against what we've been talking about so far, but the need for some vision of consequences, because people are not always good at living up to their commitments without that, and not good at therefore creating a society without that. But part of it also that if people are going to also have trouble by nature living up to their commitments, and notably, like this is a outside even of the field of political philosophy and moral philosophy as well, going back, for as long as people have been doing moral philosophy, all the way back to say Plato and Socrates and the like, Aristotle. There have been discussions of why do people fail to live up to what they want to do, what they think they should do, right? It is a fact of human beings that we don't always live up to who we want to be. And that's arguably why we have, in Judaism, a once a year period of time for asking for forgiveness and for believing that Hashem forgives us. And it's not as we can use this time to make ourselves as if we hadn't sinned, right? We can suddenly make it as if we were perfect and we're always going to be perfect. It's because in some degree we recognize that we are flawed beings who don't always live up to our perfection, our ideals for ourselves, or the Torah's ideals for ourselves, and that part of tshuva in that model, part of thinking about the tefillot, the prayers of the high holidays, is exactly this question of like, can I accept myself? Can I accept other people around me? Right? Forgive people who I think have wronged me, not because they fixed it, because I recognize that like their ideal self is not the person who wronged me. They wronged me because of human nature not being everything it could be. That human nature is in Hebrew lo mashu. It's nothing to get excited about necessarily. Human nature, you can take a sobering and realistic view of it in some sense. And that's why to return to the text from which we started, this is a utopian vision from the vision of the future, of a perfect world in some sense, from the tefillah, right? One in which God has united all creations into one group to do God's will. But while a utopia, also very realistic because it's not one where people suddenly change, where human nature has changed. Rather, God has worked with human nature by using fear to bring people together in a way not dissimilar from that depicted in the political text we looked at. So that's this week. I would love to take some questions. I'll say quickly as a way of summing up. I think that this should give us what to think about in terms of human nature, in terms of the Chagim. As I mentioned, we will next week also explore further like what this might look like with fear as the basis for something that's not limited to fear. The way fear might open us up to other aspects of a well-lived human and religious life and social life. Okay, I see there's some questions in the chat. There might also be some Facebook. Maxine, do you think you want me to tackle first?
No, it's okay. I don't see anything on Facebook, so I guess we'll just go through the chat here.
Great. Okay. Okay, from Noah Batmiri, how does an acknowledgement of bad human nature relate to God's supposed love of humanity or any subset thereof? Does God love bad things? Right, that's a really good question. And I think part of it is just not just a question about God, right? If you say that part of human nature is that we often fail to live up to who we want to be ourselves and how we think we should be and how we think people should be in general, then part of that is saying that what it means to love another human being is to love them at the very least despite that and accepting that about them, that they're not always going to be who they want to be and who they wish they could be, who you wish they could be, certainly. And in this is a much larger tangent, the question of like might love mean loving people specifically because of their own unique failings, right? What makes them them is in fact the specific ways in which they fail to live up to their personal and our societal ideals for who they should be. Other questions. Quincy, is this then fear a very utilitarian process? You don't see fear of God as a duty we must do or emotional virtue, but a calculation to ensure security? Is any virtue in the fear of God not based on future utility? Like fear of God is a good in itself. And I mean, okay, so it's a good question. Is there a way of thinking the fear of God that it itself is valuable? Or is it purely that fear of God helps you attain some other ends? That is a good question. It's a much broader question about the mitzvot in general, the way mitzvot have values or like purposes. One thing I'll say is the question of if fear is its own value, then you can't give any reason for it. You can't say it's its own value because it achieves X, Y, or Z, because then you've said really some X, Y, or Z is the value. I think this is a much more utilitarian model for understanding fear of God than some understandings of it might be. But I think that's what I was trying to get at, is that I think there is a sort of basic sense here where like it's on a really basic level of like fear of consequences is a good thing for life in general. And that because of a sense of human beings as not perfect, right? If you have a sense of human beings as like they don't need to be afraid of things in order to be perfect all the time, they don't need the consequences, then this becomes more complicated. But if you think fear is like, if you think that human nature is fraught sometimes, then this can be very valuable. From one last question, how does Torah's fear differ from or similar to sacrifices, for example, to the volcano, that it not erupt? So this will be a good lead in towards questions also of next week, because part of the question is, what's the difference between, say, fearing God versus fearing the volcano? Part of that is a question of how do we identify with the ends of the society, with the goals of the society, with God's goals, with the volcano's goals, as it were. Simply fearing God and simply fearing the volcano in order to not get hurt is a basic level, right? There's something valuable with that, but there's something like understandable of that. If we really thought bringing sacrifices to the volcano would keep us alive for longer, we'd be justified in doing so, I think. But the question is, does it, does the parallel breakdown? Is maybe Judaism, the Torah, about using fear to create some sort of larger project, larger side thing that we really think is valuable, right? But we actually identify with the goal of it. It's not just about like saving our own lives. It's actually about achieving something or making ourselves into something better. In which case the volcano would not be the same, because the volcano model is just about like saving our own lives in the immediate presence, not about trying to attain some other more worthwhile goal and trying to become someone better. So I think that's our time.
Yeah, just if I can quickly bring in two more thoughts from Ozzy. Right when I
Yeah,
said it
absolutely.
on Facebook, I
Yeah.
stood corrected. So his first comment ties in really nicely with what you were just saying, I think. This is from, yeah, I guess, okay. People thought they were going to die at Sinai. Moses said, do not have fear of being punished because God is not trying to kill you. But the lightning show is meant to create a sense of awe in the Jewish people. Test usually implies a test of love, like in God testing Abraham or Jonah. God being angry simply means that there are consequences to human sin. It is not anger in the human sense of the word. Man being sinful from his youth sounds like the original sin. Fear may be a necessary first step, but can't carry us all the way. And then he also says, often when we say God is angry, we're projecting feeling about ourselves onto God. Because we worship idols, we feel that God should be angry at us and should punish us, but God does not punish as much as we punish ourselves. Yes, any
Interesting. Some of that is I agree with in terms of fear, not being the only important element here and trying to build something larger. I think the question of projection is interesting. It's why I actually want to start with Machiavelli and the question of like, if God gave us a mitzvah to fear God, why is that, and what might that be? Why might that be valuable? Because that's not about what we project on God. That's, as it were, about what we see as a commandment and a mitzvah and the role of that. As for, again, the question of fear as a basis and trying to get beyond that, you'll have to come back next week.
Okay, great. Thank you, Levi Morrow, and thank you to
Thank
everyone
you.
here participating, for being part of our learning community. Tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Eastern, we're going to be having the first of two sessions with Professor Benjamin Summer. He'll be taking us through Psalm 27 in the Hebrew with a careful eye. And if you're here, you're probably interested in Jewish thought. And you might also really enjoy Dr. Dror Bondi's class on Heschel's transformative Hasidism meeting on Tuesdays at 2:30 Eastern. And we have over a dozen classes scheduled for the El Osman with really great teachers. And you can learn more and register at elul.drisha.org.